Emma Kaplan, and this is a WCS Wild Audio podcast, where you'll find reported audio stories covering the latest news and newsmakers from WCS's field sites, zoos, aquarium, and their conservation partners. We've got a great episode today, so let's get right to it. Since the COVID pandemic began, we've developed commonly understood best practices to avoid catching the virus from others. Vaccinate, wear a mask, and socially distance. As we move into year 3 of the crisis, WCS Executive Director for Health, Chris Walser, and WCS Vice President for International Policy, Sue Lieberman, say we now need a new set of best practices to reduce pathogen spillover at the source. Nat Moss has the story.
Scientists in the health field from around the globe gathered in Berlin in the fall of 2019 to reaffirm the 2004 Manhattan Principles, which captured the One Health idea that human, animal, and ecosystem health are all intertwined. And they identified the threats and risks associated with zoonoses, diseases that could spill over between animals and people. Little did they know that the very thing they feared would soon be confronted on a global scale.
The first time I heard about it, I didn't think too much about it, honestly. I thought, well, okay, it's another virus. I didn't grasp it. And it was only a colleague of mine who I spoke to on about the 10th, 11th of January who wrote to me, this is going to be the big one. I'm heading home. And then I thought, okay, if he's a very good virologist. I thought, if he thinks this is going to be big, I should look at it more closely.
That's Chris Walser. He's been tracking the source and transmission of viral pathogens for decades. He says it's understandable that the focus on pandemic preparedness has been on the availability of vaccines, ventilators, PPE, and issues of equitable distribution. But as his colleague Sue Lieberman notes, it's also very important to attack the problem at the source.
The key point of stopping pandemics at the source is it is much cheaper and easier to stop something rather than to clean up afterwards. We've all heard the old adage, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Well, that's just as true now as it ever was. It's much easier and makes much more sense to go as far what's called upstream as possible to the source of the virus or other pathogen and stop it from spilling over.
Chris identifies a handful of key priorities for preventing pandemic at the source.
I think there's several things that we need to do urgently. Certainly, wildlife, animal markets for human consumption in urban centers, we need to stop. One of the things that really distinguishes these type of markets is that they trade in live wildlife. And because they are alive, the animals are actually able to shed viruses.
But while confronting spillover in urban consumer markets is critical, preventing contact between people and novel pathogens begins in the wild, especially those intact forest areas where so many dangerous viruses have long been contained.
Stopping deforestation is essential because these edges where we interact with wildlife increases through deforestation, providing opportunities for increased contact with wildlife and opportunities for pathogens to explore new hosts. And then any kind of encroachment that involves, exploitive or extractive industries will have to be really carefully revisited to think about what are the health consequences.
We've learned a lot of things in the 2 years of the COVID-19 pandemic, says Sue Lieberman, and one of them is that there's no international agreement that will deal with wildlife, forest integrity, and preventing spillover of viruses and other pathogens. Sue thinks we need one urgently. The World Health Assembly of the WHO is working on one now.
We need to ask ourselves, what could we have done 3 years ago to prevent this one, and how do we make sure we do it now to prevent the next one? And I think by the World Health Assembly agreeing to launch this process, there's a recognition that we need to look forward to something that touches all the bases and then help governments come together to prevent the next pandemic.
To his own admitted amazement, given the obstacles we face, Chris nevertheless looks to the future with hope.
I'm actually very optimistic because the pandemic has changed the way we think about our world. This understanding that an intact and functioning environment is essential to our health and to mitigate climate change has really become strongly centered in everyone's life.
Chris says there's going to be a lot of pushback. There are economic pressures to return to as it was before. But with science, greater awareness, and action, we have a chance to establish new rules of the road and prevent another global pandemic. For WCS Wild Audio, this is Nat Moss.